This is an Odyssey original.
This is the War in Ukraine Daily, and yep, that's a name change. I'm Charles Feldman.
I'm Mike Simpson from the KNX Odyssey studios in Los Angeles. We spent the last 2 years on this show covering the pandemic. It was the world's biggest story. Shifting gears now, focusing on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Today, more accusations of war crimes by Russia as this maternity hospital in Ukraine is apparently bombed.
We speak with a woman in southern Ukraine, in an area currently under Russian control.
The Vice President, Kamala Harris, traveling to Poland, has taken in a huge number of Ukrainian refugees, but this comes as the Pentagon rejects a plan to hand over Polish fighter jets to Ukraine.
And sanctions against Russia, they are ratcheting up, with the U.S. officially banning Russian oil, but could that move backfire?
We start with this attack that Ukraine's president's calling an atrocity. Russian airstrike hit a maternity hospital in a port city, Mariupol, trapping children, others under the rubble. David Sheffer's a senior fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations. So, David, from the outside, it seems obvious Russia's committing war crimes. Is that the case?
What is taking place in Ukraine is so self-evident in terms of a daily barrage of criminal conduct by the Russian military. And we know that that conduct reaches all the way to the top to Vladimir Putin. There's no misunderstanding here about command responsibility. That is very evident in this case. So that being said, obviously when one tries to investigate and draw up indictments against alleged war criminals, one has to be extremely precise and demonstrate to the court that the targeting of civilians and of civilian structures such as hospitals, first of all, occurred, and then secondly, occurred through some sort of command structure that directed such targeting. Now, sometimes there's a defense in war crimes cases that this was an errant missile or a mistaken application of artillery shelling, that there was no intention to hit the civilian population. But the circumstances of Ukraine are so obvious that this shelling is hitting a massive amount of strictly civilian structures, obviously with civilians inside, as well as civilians who are simply trying to escape along, corridor routes within cities to escape all the shelling, and yet they still get shelled. I think that's going to be a very difficult defense to raise. And let me just add one kind of interesting wrinkle for Ukraine. This is a war of aggression. So you have, on top of your classic war crimes and crimes against humanity calculations and investigations, the fact that all of this has been unleashed under the umbrella of a war of aggression, which is illegal. So for a military commander to then say, oh, yes, I invaded Ukraine illegally. I mean, let's accept that argument that I invaded it illegally, but I still have the right to engage in combat with all of these weapons and just blow civilian neighborhoods apart. And you have to prove that I was not making a mistake in doing so, kind of defies the logic of what a war of aggression unleashes. In other words, you shouldn't be firing any of these munitions at all because you started it under a war of aggression.
So there's the case. What do you do with it if the aggressors don't care?
Well, in this case, they do not appear to care, which is not going to be very good for their defense. The International Criminal Court has jurisdiction to investigate Ukraine and this war of aggression and the other atrocity crimes. 39 state parties of the International Criminal Court referred Ukraine in an unprecedented step to the ICC prosecutor for investigation earlier this week or late last week. And so that means that there will be, and there is now, an official investigation of all of this with very talented expert investigators and a very talented prosecution team in The Hague. They can arrive at indictments which will not be, they won't be impossible with respect to the leadership, which is sometimes very difficult in war crimes because you have to work up the chain and sort of prove that a leader who didn't write anything down or say anything actually was responsible for unleashing the hell on earth. In this case, we know that Putin unleashed hell on earth. He says it publicly. He incriminates himself every day. He leaves footprints everywhere. If he is indicted, then I would argue, and his generals, I would argue that the sanctions regime, which has been severely imposed upon Russia, will not be lifted unless two things at least occur. One, the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine is restored with the withdrawal of Russian forces. That's basic. And second, they will not be released in total, at least, until there is a surrender of indicted fugitives from justice to The Hague. And that means that there will be internal pressure to depose Putin and the generals, get them out of the way. They're toxic, they're pariah, and let Russia recover as a society from their misbegotten leadership. This is what happened in Serbia after the Balkans War. They got rid of Milosevic, who was indicted, sent him to The Hague, and then they started to recover. So I would expect that will happen with Russia. It's implausible to think that the sanctions will be lifted without the surrender of these individuals to justice.
David Sheffer, senior fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations, a former ambassador at large for war crimes issues.
We've spoken to a number of people in Ukraine dealing firsthand with the effects of Russia's invasion. Today, we're joined by Sophia. She lives in southern Ukraine near the Sea of Azov in an area currently occupied by the Russians.
She says it's strange right now, the Russians in control, but they seem surprised. Ukrainian people aren't happy about it. Sophia, tell us more about this.
In the first day when the war started, all troops, all territorial defense squads, they were withdrawn from Verdansk. So local authorities never officially explained why they did this, but many people say that it was done to protect the city from bombing and from civilian deaths. Maybe you've heard in Mariupol, it's near to Verdansk. It's been horrible there because people are dying. Only today, they have reported that Russian troops killed about 1,300 of civilians. And from that point of view, withdrawing troops from Verdansk was kind of a smart choice, but well, I understand that the priority for Ukraine now is to protect the northern front, so like Kyiv, Kharkiv, all the cities in the north from Russian troops. So, and on the other hand, when Russian forces occupied the city, well, we saw them. They looked a little confused, they look like they don't really know what they're doing here, why they're here, or like they were expecting to see something else here. I believe actually maybe they thought, they believed their own propaganda, and maybe they thought that we would welcome them here, and of course we're not. We don't want them here. So basically, yeah, that's quite strange. I actually saw a woman here in Verdansk in the store. She was shouting to one of Russian troops, and she was saying she asked them to give up, to give up. And, well, this woman, she was unarmed, and she was yelling basically to the military, to Russian military. They looked depressed and they looked confused, but unfortunately they didn't give up yet.
So what is it like day to day there? We said you're staying with your little brother and your family.
Yeah.
Do you have, is there food? We've heard all these different reports about how hard it is to get stuff, a week and a half in now. Can you go outside? Can you kind of go to the store? You mentioned you were there. Give us what it's like with them around all the time.
Well, currently the situation in the city is kind of under control. Local authorities they say that they won't cooperate with Russian troops, but basically troops are controlling most of administrative buildings. But still, it looks like they have occupied the city, but they don't know what to do next. Well, for now, we do not see them doing something, setting their administration over here. A couple of days ago, Russians blew up a gas pipeline, Mariupol-Berdyansk gas pipeline. So basically, we are now without gas or any heating, but you can go to stores and unfortunately, Russian troops, they do not allow any Ukrainian humanitarian convoys, any humanitarian aid into the city that carry important food, medicine, other essential provisions. And instead, they are bringing their humanitarian convoys from temporary occupied Crimea to film propaganda stories for Russian TV. They want to show to Russians that people here in Berdyansk and southern regions, that they are happy with Russian government. And to prevent such videos, to prevent these fakes, people here in Berdyansk, we go to peaceful protests with Ukrainian flags every day. We sing Ukrainian national anthem. We tell Russians that we don't want them here. We ask them to leave the city, to get out. And, as I said, I believe this rallies, this protests, are quite confusing for Russian military.
Right. Sophia, I'm curious, first of all, what do you do in Ukraine before the war began, that is?
Well, I actually lived in Kiev for 6 years. I worked there. I've studied there for 4 years, and then I worked there for 2 years. But before the war started, just the day before the war started, I was feeling that something is coming. And as my family live in Berdyansk, I just wanted to see them. I wanted to come here and check if everything is okay. I was really worried to be alone in Kiev, and I wanted to see my family, so I went back here.
All right, so
the day before.
I'm also curious, Sophia, you had mentioned before that you were in a store, or near a store, and there was a woman there, a Ukrainian woman, who was yelling, I think you said, at one of the Russian soldiers. Have you had any communication with any of the occupying Russians? I presume you speak Russian, yes or no?
Yeah, I speak Russian, but the only communication I had with them was at the checkpoint when we entered the city. We actually, me and my family, we moved to our friends for 2 days when the war started, and then we came back to Berdyansk. And we went back the day it was occupied. It was at the end of February, I guess February 27, 28. And we saw Russian equipment, and we saw Russian troops. They have checked our car. They didn't ask for any documents. We just said that we were returning home, and they said, "Yeah, okay, you can go." So basically, that was it. As I'm aware, they're not communicating with any civilians. They're just trying to. They're trying to pursue our local administrations to give up the city and to cooperate with them.
How crazy is it to you that some of them do seem confused, that they do believe their own propaganda, that they thought they were coming in to free you guys from something?
They are absolutely. I mean, it's crazy because I don't know if you have seen the videos where Russian prisoners of war call their mothers. These are young guys, like 18, 19, 20 years old, and they tell their mothers that they're in captivity, that their friends have died in battle in Ukraine, that they were commanded to kill civilians in a foreign country, and they asked their mothers to do something. They asked them to go to protest to ask Putin to stop this, and their mothers, they do not believe them. They just say, well, what am I to do with it? What can I do? I don't want to. I can't do anything. And as far as I know, more than 12,000 of Russian servicemen have already died in Ukraine, and Russia do not even want to take back their bodies. And this is the first case in the history, I think, and it says more than needs to be said about Russia.
So, for you, how? Let me interrupt for a second. I'm curious also. How you said you're staying with your little brother? How old are you? How old is your little brother?
I'm 23. My little brother is 15. We are staying here with our stepmom. And my dad is in army right now.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about the emotional toll that this must be taking. I mean, you're only 23 years old. That's pretty young. Your brother's even younger. And only 2 weeks ago, you were living in a peaceful country. Now you're living in a city that's occupied by the Russian army. That must be an enormous drain on both of you and your entire family, for that matter, emotionally as well as physically?
Well, of course, it's pretty hard. It's pretty confusing. We don't know what's going to be next or what's going to happen. But we are strongly convinced that we're going to win. Ukraine is going to win. We know it for sure because we are sure that Russia is going to lose. It's just how it should be. That's for starters. And basically, we've been in war with Russia for 8 years now. Actually, it didn't start on February 24th. Russia has occupied Crimea and our southern regions 8 years ago, and we knew it's coming. We were hoping that, I don't know, the authorities in Russia would change, that Putin would lose election or something else would happen. We all, of course, hoped for the best, but we were preparing for this. We were feeling Russia, they are convinced to destroy Ukraine as a country, and therefore we knew it's coming, and now we are united as never. I constantly speaking to my friends from around Ukraine, and I see them helping, doing their best, joining territorial defense or volunteering or trying to help people with a house and so on. So that's why that is what holding us together. That's what keep us going.
Yeah, and that's the sense we get from everybody we talk to. Sophia, thank you so much for talking to us.
Coming right up after a short break, what should have been a straightforward trip to Poland for Vice President Harris, well, it's turned awkward. Vice President Kamala Harris traveling to Warsaw to thank Poland for taking in so many Ukrainian refugees, but things are not so simple. This after the Pentagon turned down an offer from Poland's government.
Poland wanted to move some military planes to a U.S. base so the planes could then be handed over to the Ukrainians, but the Pentagon rejected that. Journalist Phil Ittner is in Lviv, Ukraine. Phil, explain more about what's going on.
The problem here for the Ukrainians is they're trying to make the Russians pay for their air superiority, and by making them pay, hopefully diminish that air superiority. And they're saying they just don't have the equipment to do it. The president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has asked for a no-fly zone, but that seems to be a non-starter because that would put NATO troops, forces in the air in a deterrence against Russian air power. And of course, the consequences of that could be pretty catastrophic. So the Ukrainians have said, second to a no-fly zone, we want as much anti-aircraft, or we want these MiGs from Poland. Well, moving MiGs, certainly flying them in from any border region is going to be problematic. They tried to maybe perhaps send it to Germany and then fly them out that way so that Poland wouldn't be directly connected. But all of this machinations have fallen apart because at the end of the day, it's been determined, certainly by Washington, and I was just monitoring the Pentagon press briefing today, that's just a non-starter because it would be too provocative. However, the Pentagon does say that they are willing to step up their portable systems, their man-pad short-range anti-aircraft weapons. The Ukrainians will be happy to get that, but at the end of the day, unless they can stop those jets, those are the real problems. The fast-moving jets, they can knock helicopters out of the air, but those fast-moving jets that are used to attack any number of targets within Ukraine, and of course, tragically hearing some of these civilian targets, the Ukrainians say it's just not enough. So there's growing frustration with the West here inside Ukraine.
Okay, so the Poles were going to give us the jets, and they wanted us to give them over. But again, that's a little too close to comfort for the Pentagon, because then it looks like we're literally giving these arms. And if one of these Ukrainians in a Polish jet shoots down a Russian airplane, then we're too close to that NATO line for comfort from our perspective. So that's from the Pentagon. And then they're also talking today about some of the weapons. Again, more evidence of some of these banned weapons that Russia is either using or thinking of using, right?
There's a lot of disturbing talk coming out of the Ministry of Defense in Moscow and also the Foreign Ministry. They are floating these ideas that there are chemical weapons plants within Ukraine funded by the United States, and that they would either use that against Russian troops, or the accusation is that the Russians have been making is that the Ukrainians would use it against their own people, which shows an alarming sense of cynicism and a clear misunderstanding of the people of Ukraine. But the Russian accusation is that they would create a false flag using chemical weapons, blame it on the Russians, and then, of course, the international community would be obligated to come in, and this whole thing would be ratcheted up. I must note, however, that I was in Georgia in 2008, and we heard exactly the same thing. And we heard it again in 2018. This is almost a page that they took from their playbook. You'd think they'd switch it up now and again, but this does seem to be something the Russians like to accuse the countries that they would like to, well, frankly, subjugate and say, well, the Americans are creating these illegal weapons, and we better do something about it first. And then even if it does get used, the Russians tend to say, well, it was all by design. So despite those reports coming out of Moscow, very few people think there's any credibility to it.
I am curious about one thing, Phil, because as we pointed out, you're in the sort of the western portion of Ukraine, and I know you haven't been able to get around the entire country, but are there Ukrainians that you've encountered who are supportive of the Russians?
Oh, absolutely not. No. You're right. I'm situated in Lviv. It's my decision that this is probably the best place I can be, because this will allow me to, get information from around the country and be able to disseminate it. I have a network built over 2 decades of contacts and people both within the government and the military and just Ukrainian civil society. And almost to every Ukrainian I've spoken to, nobody thinks that the Russians coming in are a good thing. Nobody stands for that, with the possible exception of those 2 breakaway republics out in the Donbass. But they've seen 8 years of war, and they're just happy to see the shooting at least decrease or move on to other locations. So. And there are many ethnic Russians out in the far east of this vast country. So there has been grumbling. I have heard from out in those breakaway republics that we're just glad the fighting stopped. Thank God the Russians came in and now the fighting has stopped. But that is just a rump part of this country. This country is, as we have discussed, Mike and Charles, in the past. I've been coming here 21 years. I've never seen this country as united as it is. This is a country that is just solidified in its determination to fight off this attack. I've seen young men and women going to these what were artist unions here in Lviv, which is kind of an artistic town, a very bohemian town, and they're turning all of their canvases into camouflage coverings for armed positions. We've got welding locations and car mechanics making tank blockades. So this is a nation completely mobilized to try and stop the Russians, and I've never seen it like it before.
Phil Ittner there in Lviv. Phil, thanks for talking to us again.
Many were calling for it, and now it is official. The U.S. has banned oil and gas imports from Russia in an attempt to strangle the Russian economy while they wage war in Ukraine.
There are fears the move could backfire here in the U.S. We're already seeing it with record-high gas prices. Milton Ezrati, chief economist at Vested, a communications firm. Milton, could we see a recession here in the U.S.?
We could. I think the pressure is not so much this last gesture of cutting off Russian oil imports. They're very small for the United States. But we have effectively pushed Russian oil off world markets. I know there's a carve out within SWIFT for them to continue to sell oil. That's being done for Europe's sake, not ours. But the Russian oil is not moving. The carriers will not carry it. The insurers will not insure it. So it is as if the world has banned Russian oil. This is going to go harder on Europe than us. But if the world goes into recession, we will. There's also the chance that the Federal Reserve is going to start raising rates to deal with the inflation, and that also contributes to recessionary pressures.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, does the Fed now find itself in a bind because before this war in Ukraine, as you know, and as they said, they were intending to raise interest rates because of inflation that was brought about by a resurgence of trade, I suppose, after the pandemic started to wane, at least in the western part of the world. But now that we've got this war going on, might their solution to one problem cause a different one?
Well, yes, it's a very a tightrope the Fed has to walk here. They can't not act because the inflation was more fundamental than just the war. If it was just the war, they could say we're going to weather this thing until we get Putin to back down and so forth. But the inflation was much more fundamental. It was even more fundamental than supply chains because we have printed enough money to float an entire navy. So there was this pressure. The Fed has to deal with this, but if they go too fast, they're going to precipitate a recession. So they're walking a very fine line here. They're going to make their first announcements later this month. We'll see how they're handling it. They could easily screw up.
Does it help that we still have? They could easily screw up. Does it help that we still have some post-pandemic yearning to spend, at least among some people? But then again, if you can't afford anything or you can't find something, then it doesn't matter if you want to spend your money.
Well, I think the supply chain problems, except for this oil issue with the war, the supply chain problems were beginning to dissipate. So the idea of finding what you wanted was becoming less of a problem. But as I said, the inflation was there before we did anything with this fighting with our sanctions, and the Fed will have to act in some way to quell that. Otherwise, it's going to get built into the economy, and we're going to have a lot more trouble in the long run. As far as the recession is concerned, I don't think we are facing anything imminent in this respect, even with the cutoff in oil. Because there is some of this momentum in the economy, this post-pandemic recovery. Yes, a lot of the money has been eaten up by inflation, but I think that'll carry us through to the end of the year and into 2023. But after that, a lot depends on the Fed and a lot depends on how soon we can resolve this situation in Europe.
You know, Mike and I were chuckling, you may have heard, when you sort of said that the Fed could screw it up. And that actually leads to the question, you know, people tend to think that these people at the Federal Reserve, that they're all these sort of, I don't know, geniuses, and they know exactly what to do to steer the country. But historically, as you know, the Fed has often screwed things up. So how could we be confident that these people really know what they're doing?
We can't.
That's very comforting.
They're some of the best in the world, and I'm not taking away from them, but there's only so much that can be done. And the Fed, if it moves too slowly, the inflation gets embedded in the economy. If it moves too fast, it precipitates a recession. So it's like breaking on ice. Of course, you're in LA, you don't know much about that. It's like breaking on ice. You press too hard and you skid out of control. You press too softly and you don't stop. So the Fed has a very difficult job here. They may be the best in the world. They're better than I am, but that doesn't mean that they can't screw up. They have in the past.
We just crossing our fingers here and hoping for the best, which is what we always do, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, at least Jay Powell is aware of the problem. 3 months ago, he wasn't. So that's encouraging.
All right. Milton Ezrati, chief economist at Vested.
In an interview with a German newspaper, Ukrainian President Zelensky says he doesn't think Vladimir Putin will use nuclear weapons in a war. Zelensky believes Putin is bluffing, and his threats about potentially using nukes are a sign of weakness. You only threaten the use of nuclear weapons when nothing else is working, says Zelensky. Every use of nuclear weapons, he goes on to say, means the end for all sides, not just for the person using it.
This is an Odyssey original. You can find this podcast and others on the Odyssey app, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and on Stitcher.